some of the findings of the projects that we engaged in earlier this year. And really the aim of the project was, as the title suggests, we were looking for any lessons we could learn from the policing of COVID-19. As we know, if you could do the next slide, please, Sean. As we know, this has been, this phrase unprecedented challenge is used consistently because despite many agencies talking about the possibility that there could be a worldwide pandemic, broadly speaking, very few nations internationally were prepared for it when it came. And this has led almost to us having to, in a sense, invent new systems and new mechanisms almost on a daily basis. And this has provided a tremendous challenge for police, as it has for anyone who's been involved in this and the general public. And so the presentation today really is to try and sort of reflect on some of the findings from this kind of worldwide overview that we did with Fair Trials and the other authors on the report, to look at what had happened during COVID-19 and what we can learn from it, and more importantly, how that learning can kind of impact into what we might do into the future and come up with new and better ways of responding. Next slide, please, Sean. So what I wanted to start with really are just a few quick slides from images taken from around the world that I've called images from the pandemic. Really, if we start, and these perhaps are some of the worst images from the pandemic, the very antithesis of what you might call rights-based policing. We've seen an incredible variation in approach from different police agencies internationally. And some of these ones really do show what we might call a highly securitized, threat-based, violent-based approach. In the top left-hand corner, as you look at the image, we have a group of migrant workers. I'll not go by nation. I don't want to name and shame nations, but a group of migrant workers being sprayed with bleach to ensure that they weren't carrying the virus. In the top middle, we have police sort of meting out some kind of justice for somebody who was not abiding by the curfews. The top right, again, another individual being dragged away from an event where they'd kind of, I think there was a protest in that one, and this person shouldn't have been there, so police just dragged them away. In the left-hand side, in the middle, we've got an image of what was referred to as I think it was called a COVID rod. And the idea was that this would keep members of the public at least 2 meters away from the police officer that was deploying it. And again, we see yet another example of police moving somebody away from a protest. If we move on to the next slide, please, Sean. Here's some more, by contrast, different approaches to policing. So again, what we have really is what we might call much more community-oriented, perhaps rights-based policing, where individuals, in a sense, have been supported by police. In the bottom left, we see a police officer serving food to, these are a group of homeless individuals. Again, in the top left, we have police engaging with the public, describing, giving them the rules, what they need to do. In the top and centre, again, we have police officers using hand sanitizer to help somebody who's living on the streets. And likewise, in the top right, we've got police again serving water and food to, I think those people were individuals who were sex workers, who the police in that case felt that these were individuals who were going to be sort of vilified and blamed for the pandemic, so went out of their way to support and help them. So we've got these real contrasting images internationally from, as we said, the ones I showed at the beginning, this kind of highly securitized, almost violent policing approach to shift people off the streets, almost to punish people and to treat them, in some ways as it's sort of infectious almost, through to another approach in these other images, which is much more community oriented, much more based upon the individuals that are being policed. So given all these range of things, what did we learn when we started to study a more depth policing approaches? Next slide, please, Sean. Again, sorry, I forgot I've got this slide in there. This is just another one. This is police officer infected with coronavirus shares safeties over PPE. And again, those of you who've worked in policing, who do work in policing, doubtless have seen these kind of issues presented consistently, with lack of PPE, challenges, fears of being infected and so on. So really the kind of work that we did focused upon what police had done, what we could learn from it, and how we could build forward, as I mentioned at the outset. So really there seems to be sort of 4 broad factors that seem to be important within the policing of COVID-19. The first one is the kind of legislation and criminal justice context in which policing is being conducted. Okay, so what rules and regulations have legislatures actually created, the police are then invited to enforce. The second one is, again, the approaches police have taken to engage with different stakeholders, both the public and other agencies with which they work. The third sort of factor has been police wellbeing and the impact that's had more broadly across how police have been able to police the pandemic. And finally, this broader sense of police engagement with communities more broadly, not just stakeholders, but how police engage with the public generally. And out of those, we'll review some of the findings, and then what I'll do is conclude with some recommendations moving forward. So next slide, please, Sean. Okay, so if we look at legislation, this has presented some challenges because, again, for many police agencies, legislation was often created very rapidly by government, often, for want of a better term, on the hoof, all of a suddenly produced and handed over to police, and often with minimal input from law enforcement. Now, the argument here isn't that law enforcement should write legislation, but law enforcement do ultimately have to enact it. And frequently we've seen during Covid-19, various rules and regulations were created, which made it very difficult for police to conduct their duties, or at least to know how to enact or enforce the particular legislation. I mean, this stems from a number of things. I think the first point is probably that within the international health regulations, most nations produce national pandemic plans, but most of these were targeted to pandemic influenza, and certainly not to a coronavirus like Covid-19. That has, from an epidemiological point of view, certain contexts which are important for legislation for a flu type of infection. But from a coronavirus, it's slightly different. The infection's slightly different, the mortality is slightly different, and so on. So some of the responses were problematic in as much as they were following the playbook that you might create for a pandemic flu. But more than that, generally speaking, the international health regulations and national pandemic plans made no mention of policing at all. Most of them, if you review them all currently to date, there's probably one or two of them worldwide who actually make any comment about police at all. And in those, they generally say law enforcement will conduct duties as usual and other duties as needed. And of course, that's a very, very wide berth to present with police. So you carry on your normal duties and anything else that we might think of without really specifying what it might be. And broadly, there was a failure by government and others to really think about what role police would play. That, police law enforcement have a role to protect the public as one of their roles, investigate crime. So all the usual roles were being required of police. But also, police were often required to, in certain places, police curfews, or to ensure lockdown or was followed, or to deal with often different legislation within the same area. So there was a good example from the United Kingdom where one part of a town was put under lockdown and another part of the town was under a kind of slightly lower version of lockdown because the infection wasn't as problematic. Of course, the police's problem is how do you then police that? Because the thing that demarcated the two areas was a main road. So do the police stand in the middle of the road and stop one set of people moving into the other, or do they put up roadblocks, or what do they do? And this has been a consistent problem throughout the world with, because in a sense, the pandemic, the infection, the virus has not really respected normal political boundaries or operational lines. And I think part of this also was this kind of failure, in a sense, of police and law enforcement to really engage with legislators about what their role could be and whether or not some of the ideas and rules that were created could actually even be enacted at all. And so, of course, this left the space for often vague, unclear legislation that the police then had to enforce. And this, of course, opens the door to all kinds of variations in policing methodologies, from either a highly securitized response or from different engage and explain type responses, or various other different responses almost within the same organizations, let alone throughout into different international boundaries. Next slide, please, Sean. Another problem that the police have faced within the pandemic as well is the need to work with other agencies. And this has become writ large within the response of all organisations. And there's been many problems. Some areas have had it much easier than others, often where those areas, those nations have spent a lot of time creating these kind of stakeholder engagement and good working relationships between different entities. where these have had to be kind of created almost, on the hoof during the pandemic, there's often been many problems. And we've had all kinds of challenges in terms of, to begin with, difficult of identifying who the stakeholders actually are that, for example, law enforcement needs to work with. We've seen things like distrust among different stakeholders. This has led, of course, to things like limited cooperation and coordination. If you don't trust the people you're working with, why would you share information with them? Why would you even work with them? Often this has led to duplication of effort, where different agencies are kind of doing exactly the same thing in the same area. And this has led to public confusion and all kinds of challenges from that perspective. We often had turf wars in terms of agencies sitting around the table saying, well, we're responsible for this, and another agency say we're responsible for that. Nobody's quite clear who's responsible for other things, or agencies wishing to take the lead against other agencies and so on. We've seen gaps in provision where there's a large amount of effort placed into some aspects of legislation, whereas there's been limited work within a different area. And behaviour by one agency which is actually inconsistent with the needs of another. For example, if you take a highly securitized response to policing the pandemic, which involves strong armed law enforcement, riot police, etc., to keep people off the streets, this often can be counterproductive, because individuals often then they'll start to, in fact, what we've seen is individuals start to identify workarounds where they don't engage with the rules and regulations, where they do start to protest the policing action. And of course, the more people that are gathered together, that tends to raise the risk of greater infection, which kind of goes counterproductive to what we're trying to intend with the rules and regulations. So again, a core issue here is this idea about developing good working relationships between different stakeholders and how that can be done. But this has certainly been difficult actually trying to achieve this during a pandemic rather than trying to achieve it before. Next slide, please, Sean. Another challenge in law enforcement, again, is this idea of police well-being. And again, this challenge really for police can often lead to kind of nefarious type activities, in a sense, where police fear for their personal safety due to things like inadequate personal protective equipment, loss of resources due to people being exposed to the virus, being required to do extra work such as security of public health officials, for example, which isn't normally what police would do, or being sent to do policing work that's different from what somebody ordinarily does. Fear of infection. Police officers are human too, and they don't want to infect themselves or their family. This can then lead sort of inadvertently to kind of more draconian policing measures. In a sense, from this perspective, if you fear being infected and you fear that you might bring that infection home, etc., to your family, it's not surprising you might want to use one of those COVID rods, the 2-meter long rod that we saw in that earlier photograph, to keep people away from you. Because if you don't have the right equipment to protect yourself, and this was the case in many, many jurisdictions worldwide, then how would you police the public? You don't really want close engagement. So again, some of this notion about how we maintain police well-being in the context of a pandemic is pretty critical, because as police officers, as human beings, want to protect themselves. And if we haven't got the ability to do that, it makes it very difficult to conduct some of the policing duties that are required, particularly close contact with members of the public. And also for police more broadly, this idea of the risk of stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, etc., following from attending more deaths and bereavements and so on than one would ordinarily. Many times police are the individuals who attend sudden deaths. And there was one report in the early days of the pandemic and from the United Kingdom of a police officer who'd attended 25 sudden deaths, whereas ordinarily you might see that many in 3 years, let alone in a week. And that kind of challenge, particularly where people have died alone, etc., can be really problematic for officers about how they then deal with that. So again, this idea of increased stress impacting a variety of different things, in particular, again, the police engagement with the public. Next slide, please, Sean. And again, moving on sort of more specifically to police engagement with the communities. Again, what we've seen, and we go back to that first set of slides, these problematic enforcement strategies. We've seen 2 of those. Obviously, the first one is overuse. Well, the second one I'll take first. Overuse of draconian or violent enforcement strategies, again, has caused all sorts of challenges in terms of maintaining the peace, for want of a better phrase. Where this has been overused, frequently individuals have taken to the streets to protest against policing. And of course, as I said earlier, if there's lots of people gathered together, that is actually a potential public health risk through cross-infection of individuals. And likewise, where legislation has been unclear or uncertain, where police officers have often been in fear of their own well-being, we've often seen inconsistent policing strategies and methods, where we find variation between police officers within the same jurisdiction. Sometimes some officers using different points where they might impose fines or arrest individuals compared to other officers due to a lack of clarity in that legislation. And of course, that level of inconsistency is one of the things that absolutely challenges the public perception of police. If I get fined and you don't, then I start to think that the system is very, very unfair. And of course, as I say, as listed at the bottom there, this has resulted in all kinds of challenges for police, criticism of police, which in itself isn't problematic, but broadly, where police feel that criticism is unfair because they're enacting legislation that isn't clear, of course, that has a negative sort of spiraling impact. Again, we see reduced public trust. We know that if individuals are experiencing inconsistent policing, that really does impact negatively upon their trust for police. And of course, people don't forget, police have still got to police the same communities when the pandemic's over. And if individuals don't trust you during the pandemic, it's very hard to regain that trust moving forward. We find also where trust goes is reduced compliance with regulations. Again, that becomes highly challenging because, of course, if people say, well, it doesn't really matter what I do because, frankly, the police are violent or, are untrustworthy, of course, individuals will then start to break the rules. And if you break the rules, it leads to a greater risk of infection. We've seen injury and death as a result both of police. In some jurisdictions, more people had died at the hands of police in the early days of the pandemic than had actually caught the virus. So again, the question is about proportionality. Is that acceptable if you're trying to protect the public in the first place by having public health regulations? And of course, what we've also seen is where police have used particularly draconian and violent enforcement, it's actually led to a kind of proliferation of mis and disinformation and actually paradoxically greater acceptance of conspiracy theories. Things like if the police have to behave like this, then clearly this can't be a real thing that's serious. Therefore, there's some kind of government conspiracy at play. So again, this kind of enforcement, draconian approaches, inconsistent policing is often highly inconsistent with not only people following the regulations, but also with the broader trust and sense of legitimacy of the police. Next slide, please, Sean. And again, sitting within there, we've seen policing of disadvantaged groups too. There are hard to reach communities, individuals often of migrant labourers or individuals who would rather not have anything to do with the police. Maybe they're asylum seekers. And often the police have had difficulty engaging with these particular groups. And where they have, of course, strict enforcement of the rules can actually push these people further away from presenting in hospital through fear of being arrested because they have sort of questionable status to be in a particular country. And so again, the argument here is that this kind of phrase one size fits all strategy, so using the same strategies irrespective, can often in itself be counterproductive because there are some disadvantaged groups for whom following the legislation and following the rules is actually more difficult than for other groups. So again, how police should respond to that becomes a question. Do they adopt a more liberal approach, or do they actually adopt the same approaches for everyone? Next slide, please, Sean. So we looked at what has worked, and broadly speaking, ethical approaches, what we might call ethical. Okay, I'll just finish up. My Spanish isn't strong, so I think you're telling me I haven't got long to go. So I'll just finish up with this slide, and I can conclude off this one. Finally, what we've seen is that really the approaches to policing the pandemic that have worked best of all are the ones that we describe as ethical approaches. And these have involved things like engage and explain or harm minimization strategies, where the attempt really has been for law enforcement to actively listen to the concerns of communities, think about what the community needs and their capacity and capability of responding to the legislation, and finding ways and methods to actually engage with the community that allows them to explain the protocols, the reasons for their action, where sanctions really are the last resort, not the first one, where the riot police aren't the first people that you call to get people off the streets, but the last people where you've tried other strategies first. Well, look, you need to be off, explaining to individuals why they need to be off the streets, why that's important. This is characteristic of what we might call procedural justice policing. But what we found is that those approaches, characterised by that second set of photos I showed you, very much has resulted in far greater compliance with health regulations, maintenance of trust, in fact, increase in trust in police, and really where communities have really actually often policed themselves, where they've attempted to support the policing strategies and so on. Absolutely, there are times when enforcement needs to happen, particularly where groups are refusing to engage. But really, if that's the last resort, that seems to have been much, much greater, so much better. So really, the kind of recommendations that we would finish with is very much, for policing moving forward, to be involved in the broader legislative process, at least from the perspective of what might work, and having an open discussion with government of what might work, what legislation seems sensible, and what actually seems very difficult to enforce. That we spend time thinking about how we protect the well-being of police officers and ensure that they have the correct equipment to protect them. Because if we don't, there are some risks with the way policing might carry on. That ethical approaches involving engage and explain have been much, much more successful than highly securitized and violent policing. Absolutely, securitized is important some of the time, but certainly not as a first resort, because that actually results in a lack of trust for policing and often reduces compliance. So there are some strong lessons we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic that do and hopefully will feed into the future of policing. And more broadly than that, it's important really that government and that police and that anyone, all stakeholders are engaged, including NGOs, are engaged in discussion moving forward of how is the best way to respond to the next pandemic, and certainly how best can we make use of police and their expertise. We absolutely need it, but there are better ways of deploying law enforcement and police than at times have been used during the previous pandemic. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks, Sean.